003, Pig Eye, and Mullygrub. Slamming the truck door behind him, Gnome, as usual, didn't lock up the rusty old vehicle, not thinking twice as he crow-hopped over and around the puddles, nearly slipping on a mashed smear of junk mail pulp, tiptoeing around each node through the obstacle course of greasy trash accented with small animal barbecue bones. He cleared the remaining spaces between his sad truck and the establishment's standard steel and glass double doors. Carefully retracting his hand into his sleeve as not to touch the handlebar, he heaved it and the door flew open, which, in turn, immediately stuck, jamming itself with a lurch into a sweeping, well-worn groove in the concrete. Gnome slipped through the gap as the weather blasted past him into the room, but could not close the door immediately again. He looked up around him and could see very little through the fogged, wet lenses on his face, but the room was darker than usual, as if half the fluorescent lights were out and had not been replaced. Gnome struggled with the door as a massive gust of wind blew into the space past him, and an array of forlorn faces raised their eyes to see his scarecrow-like figure comically struggling with all its limbs to reseal the airlock, but, too exhausted to be annoyed, few customers crowding the periphery of the room took him in for more than a moment, as Gnome employed all his physical effort to yank the door shut with a gusty whoop, a dramatic entry into an unusually usual location, especially for someone on the National Science Board. With his glasses completely fogged and coated with droplets, Gnome stood with his back braced against the door and did his best to absorb the environment, darker, dirtier, and busier than times before. The myriad forms before him, suitcases with laundry baskets parked in them, containers really, all manner of quadratic forms and their human counterparts, hunched bodies intermingled and bulked up in warm weather gear, guardedly cocooned in puffy winter jackets, sleeping bags garnished by thick plastic tarps, lots of plastic, and even a few animals. The many encampments were draped, piled, and slumped in such a way that it was hard to tell where the textiles ended and the humans began, amidst the mounds of dirty versus clean laundry, each paired with their heaps of balled-up clothing and personal belongings, all human faces underlit by the glow of a handheld device hovering under their chins, kids doing homework on the floor. So many this time, so many people. Some looking like they'd been camping out there for days or weeks. Knowing the owner, Bestie, Gnome assumed no one was ever kicked out or asked to leave. But some parties seemed like they might actually be living here, which was becoming typical. Gnome felt a surge of sadness for this painful late-stage development of humankind's fragile society. He hurt for all of it. Averting his gaze to the ground, he hid in the fog of his glasses for a moment before hearing a familiar child's laugh. "Hello, neighbor," came a small voice, just as he removed his glasses to dry them. Blinking, he saw nothing in detail, but instead a multi-layered cloud of blobs and misleading highlights. But the voice. He knew the voice. Of course. Mullygrub. The girl. The unexpected rush of feeling at the sound of a familiar voice spun his sense of equilibrium into limbo, and he blinked with confusion and tried, fruitlessly, to dry his lenses on the corner of a wet synthetic jacket. The shorter arm of the L-shaped room off to his right, which he always forgot about, featured a wide bench. Along the windowsill were the waiting room. Indoor tree loomed broad and wispy over the small families camped out around it, guarding their nests and spinning belongings up and down the rows of industrial-sized washers and dryers, some forms shuffling impatiently for the massive machines to do their work, and others were just slumped, waiting. Blank, uncertain expressions on the adults paired oddly with the frustrations of their kids trying to color on the floor atop stacks of last week's unopened junk mail, serving both as scrap paper, floor covering, and cushions. One of the resident animals, a very small dog, which was not officially allowed, shivered in a dish towel serving as a blanket. Recoiling slightly as Gnome attempted to take a purposeful step forward, a gardener paced, freely expressing dismay into a phone call, and another, hairier dog followed suit, sniffing as it explored the wide world of muddy, chemical smells that heaven's to best he had to offer. Gnome breathed it all in. The summation of the sensory experience was enough to recall every trip he'd made down the hill. Though he dared, to intervene with his utmost bestest attempts at diplomatic relations only every couple of months when it came to matters of the siblings clearly invading his property and getting into his stuff, or running amok, as Zelda liked to call it. Gnome also tried to take into account the technicalities, the complicated minutiae of their upbringing, or lack thereof. He was nevertheless to be taken into account. Re-encountering their living conditions, damp and bitterly stained human aspects of a corridor of material, his mind continued down a winding tunnel of thought. But what kind of scale was there just fine measured on? With lost kids and their lost shoes? And was it all just weird for him to be doing this? Personally couriering an alleged lost shoe in the bramble of his hillside forest garden back to its suspected owner was, in most circles perhaps, a task far beyond the call of neighborly duty. But in this case, and with this particular family, Gnome needed to once again softly acknowledge the existence of trespassing, without outright blaming the youth for all the strange happenings on his property. The letters back and forth were okay, but at this point, a face-to-face discussion with the children's caretaker was really preferred. And he also suspected that this line of reasoning also allowed for a sort of incognito carrot on this stick of life, that extra impetus to trick himself into getting out of the house and back in touch with others. Such an excuse was just the ticket. Oh, and he reminded himself, speaking of tickets, there was the party. He should invite the neighbors, regardless of what Zelda thought or said, or attempted to forbid. Yes, he thought again, as he calmly re-engaged a round of self-reflection and general concern for their well-being, even if they always claimed, "We're fine, just fine," the few times they had attempted to talk about it. Lost. Molly Grubb's voice chimed in again, returning like a song above the hum, whir, and careening chorus of mechanics versus deafening tedium. Craning his head, the ancient, bristling white hairs curiously pouted like whiskers from his ears, helped catch and muffle the sounds all at once. Gnome squinted towards the direction of the welcoming committee, where a small light, like a visual anchor at the end of his blurry vision tunnel, a spot where his brain was able to fill in the blanks and separate the forms of two kids sprawled out chaotically on what would clearly emerge as the reception desk, an old octagonal wood and green felt poker table set against the backdrop of a pale post-it yellow painted wall, also speckled with post-its. Beelining, Noah moved his body the dozen paces to the back of the room to where the owner's sonar of a voice was certain to be found. Looking down to where his tweed only smushed the sky's oily raindrops around the surface of his lenses rather than mop them up, Gnome came to a stop, hovering over their home base as he continued in a futile attempt to dry his glasses. He took the moment to absorb the abstractness of their forms through his own eyes, blob impressions visually muffled but stark animated and, as always, colorfully full of life amidst piles of manila folders, books, papers, and dried-out Play-Doh bits, and unidentifiable school supply whatevers. The two were often engaged in a fair amount of arts and crafts at the table. It was a shipwreck of staples such as construction paper, scraps, sequins, buttons, pipe cleaners, toilet paper tubes, gaudy crepe tissue paper, the old National Geographic magazines minus their decades of clippings, semi-gloss, paint markers, and zippers. Somewhere located beneath it all were perhaps even the buried treasure of their school textbooks. Overall, it was an excruciatingly beautiful human mess, thought Noam. Trying not to give the zippers special attention, even without his eyesight, Noam knew each zipper, like its worldwide brethren, was sure to feature the tiny, ubiquitous embossings below the steel hinge. Z-L-L, the mark of a zipper empire, his lifelong employer. I said, "Are you lost?" Molly Grubb addressed him in her very most business-oriented tone. "Pardon." Noam's curiosity was piqued. "In the fantasy?" "I think she's saying," the boy, her brother, hijacked the topic from across the table, "that, like, your house is so nice, and this down here might seem unreal to an uphill guy." He paused as his sister cued an intervention, backtracking. "I mean, just kidding, because we have most definitely never been in your house," she confirmed, mustering all possible sincerity. "For sure, but it looks so nice from the outside that this down here must be like some kind of..." The boy shook his head for a lack of words as his mouth made odd shapes, struggling for a comparison to bridge the difference of their lives. "This must look like a carnival freakhouse of horror to you. Or all smelly and gross." As his eyes scanned the room and settled on another group of kids by the front door, "Walter," she shot the boy a verbal warning for some kind of unidentified infraction as her eyes returned to focus steadily on her project. A felt sock puppet she was sewing together with floss. "It's going to be a platypus," she explained, trying to change the subject as she waved the duck-looking form at him. "It's made of felt. Handmade down felt from the little feathers in the lint traps," Big Eye noted proudly. "Best more snaps on her rubber gloves with this." And then she just does it and scratches. No, she peels it out of the dryer by dryer, in those bunches and rolls it all up, and it kind of like cradles it back and forth. And Noam tuned out as he watched the boy go into great detail about how to make felt out of dryer lint. But it struck him to consider how odd it was to be speaking to his neighbors face to face. These two, the years of antics. First the sprinklers when they were really, really small, like 4 or 5 years old. They'd move them, then run through them and totally piss off the gardeners. And then they got a bit older. They discovered matches, lighters, lighter fluid, and projectiles. And then there was the year of the machete. And just all the foraging and fires they may have started, all the unresolved cases, all leading to the countless angry old man showdown positions he had put himself in his own mind, regardless of who had instigated. It all seemed kind of dumb now. The stern letters, the wasted friggin' energy. It all seemed very dumb. In fact, and useless, especially when he could have just shown up. Anyhow, the boy smiled, crooning at the loss of his trail of thought. "Care for a hot glue tattoo?" As he applied a googly eye to a trapper-keeper, scorching his fingertips in the process. "Super popular with the kids these days." "Kid," she noted, nodding towards him. "Singular." She winked at home. It only hurts for a minute, he shrugged, huffing to himself. Ooh, but it is a long minute, isn't it? Just say no, she advised Gnome in a very quick whisper. But it's okay, Pig Eye continued. You can cool it and soothe it with a spray from your bottle, he nudged. My spray bottle? Like for a cat, like spray it in the face when it's misbehaving. Isn't that why you are here? To tell us to stop hunting? But the awkwardness of where that question might have gone was abruptly lost to history, drowned out by the thunk, 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 of the closest set of double-stacked machines suddenly entering a high-gear spin cycle. All interior surfaces of the waterfront washery were blanketed in a very nice vibrating hum. Despite the cutoff, Pig Eye piggybacked himself to another topic. Why did your parents name you Gnome? Gnome blinked. It's okay. No shame. They like that stuff, huh? Like sci-fi, fantasy is cool. I mean, look at us. He waved his hands around the room and sniffed, wiping his nose on a crusty sleeve and smearing glitter glue across his face. We're all welcome here. We're all in this together. And heck, I'll admit it, I'm a time cop. He paused with dead seriousness. And they named me Pig Eye. He sighed, burying his face in his palms. No, they didn't. No one did, Mollygrub countered. Or whatever the heck you want to believe about your origin stories, he shrugged. Hey, wait. Oh, do people ever say, wait a moment? Like, to wait a moment? Here. Without another word, Gnome pulled the plug on this fantastic conversation by revealing a flimsy plastic bag bundle out from his raincoat and plopping it in the middle of the table, where it rolled down a cascading pile of stuff. Oh, Pig Eye's voice dropped as he peeked from between his fingers, recognizing it immediately. The item might have otherwise blended into the tabletop chaos like camouflage, except the weight of its presence drew an almost palatable sort of extra gravity out into the air between the three of them. As the shoe flopped, settling to a stop, a singular, crafty little mud-smeared googly eye, hot glued to the side of the shoe, peeped through a part in the little plastic curtain, pendulating until it came to rest squarely on Pig Eye. Ack! You done me wrong, old googly eyes. You done me wrong, he grumbled in a dying cowboy voice, the dry gravel of words tumbling out of his mouth. The thing looked very incriminating. Molly frowned. So, this round here, folks, we got a lonely shoe left behind, tangled in the brambles in my backyard, Gnome said in a slow, deep voice, aged with 3/4 of a century's buildup of calm, uncomplicated patience and John Grisham novels. And it told me that it has been looking for its owner. He tilted his head for emphasis. That's funny. That's so funny. Because so were the cops. Pig Eye barked with excitement as his sister gave him a fervent, no. Look, owner, yeah? Of the shoe? Molly blurted nervously, eyes darted to its long-lost single shoe partner on the floor, still peeking a toe out through the crack in the door to the mudroom just behind her brother. The owner of the shoe? Sure. Gnome nodded, pacing slightly with his arms folded across his chest. Or the owner-proprietor of this fine establishment. The children looked directly at one another from under the hoods of their eyebrows. The person who I assume is a relative of yours, if not your grandmother, or your special friend if you play your cards right. I mean, Big Eye gulped as Molly kicked his knee from under the table. Ha! Come on. You know why you're really here. He chuckled, grabbing for a ball cap to shove on his head to hide from the rest of the conversation, growling with suppressed laughter. Okay, so, sir, Molly spoke, folding her hands and addressing him in a hypnotically rehearsed fashion. Thank you for your interest in this fine establishment. I'm sure with the powers of connected cleverness that we can finally connect this so-called lost shoe item with its alleged owner through the powers of our, yes, as you mentioned, special relationship to a certain guardian known henceforth as the aforementioned Best Amore. And she, in due course, will place an ad in the classified section of the local newspaper because that's what she does. Because did you know she's from Langvekistan? Even if she doesn't talk about it. And around these parts, when you are from any kind of stand, you just do it. Pig Eye boosted his sister's comment into nonsense for emphasis as Gnome scanned the geographical regions of his brain for any mention of that certain global location. But just like all the gaps in the cut-up National Geographics, it seemed to be missing. Hopefully now, nopefully, this isn't the lost cause, Molly glowed in an almost United Nations sort of appeal. Hopefully we can get you and her and all of us back on track with what we were really looking for. She raised her eyebrows with a quizzical upside-down smile as he lost track of her suggestions. Was that a question? Gnome was lost. Hopefully. But right now, she's out. Molly accented with a playful shrug and a prolonged blink over a half-bureaucratic smile. Way out. Out there. Pig Eye echoed in conclusion, sighing with a full-body shrug at the helpless definitiveness of the statement, his face suddenly illuminated by the white-purple lightning flooding the laundromat for a moment, followed by more silence and a crackle as the rain resumed. But Gnome blinked back slowly, ever so slowly, sneaking in a slight squint as was his obligation as an old person, and removed the clipboard from his raincoat. A clipboard. Molly loved clipboards. Her eyes glowed even more as she watched as time slowed when he removed the rectangular beauty from its hiding place in his jacket. Oh wow, first a shoe and now a clipboard. What else you got in there? Pig Eye marveled. Well, Gnome continued, should the proprietor ever be in again? Gnome's words were like a slow burn for the kindling of her curiosity, the world of grown humans and their letters and antics or anticipations. I'll apologize in advance because I didn't. Gnome had trouble talking and doing it at the same time. Fill in the blank. Molly had tuned out completely, looking on only lovingly at the MDF, whose edges were pulping into fuzz like moss or brown cardboard fur. But the steel clip across the top held fast. There was a small metallic silver envelope with the letters Miss Blank and Associates, elegantly calligraphied by hand on the front. If you didn't, I don't know the proprietor's name, but this is a summons? Molly blurted out as her voice rose drastically, like an exaggerated monarch, as she and her brother launched into a barrage of back-and-forth questionable hypotheses. A subpoena? A formally notarized letter of complaint? A valentine? Fine. Sold! But but not so fast. Does it come with the clipboard, by any chance? Gnome was beginning to realize just how little access he really had to the nether regions of this imaginary world he'd wandered into. These two had wrought a certain something, special to be sure, a regular crystal chandelier smolten and hewn from the raw sands of time, plus a certain magic secret ingredient, pure boredom. Well, he continued, not to be vague, it is an invite, Gnome smiled, already turning to go. Raising an eyebrow, he looked around one last time at the bunches of quiet patrons sharing the room, walked himself quietly back to the door, thinking, not that you wouldn't hesitate to invite yourselves. She works nights, came a very soft voice from the bench under the droopy tree by the windowsill. Gnome looked up to see a large presence in a security guard's uniform and a duffel bag overstuffed with stuff on the floor next to him. The grandmother, or whatever. I've seen her around. She works nights. The deep voice confirmed, all the while not looking up from the glow of a handheld electronic device. Gnome blinked and nodded. The word neglect also and often came to mind. The shoes seemed like such a tiny matter. Wait a moment! Big Eye burst out. What was that? What'd you say? No man says we should invite ourselves? Sorry, sir, Molly called from across the room. My brother pretends to hear what people are thinking. She shrugged, avoiding eye contact. Gnome sighed and turned to face the two with one final polite request. Please just get the message to her. And his hood whipped back up over his head as an alarm blipped and the security guard exited the laundromat in a hustle. Spinning to catch the door before it closed, Gnome's hands settled on the cool steel, and he winced, instantly realizing he'd forgotten to retract into his sleeve this time to avoid touching it naked. The night wind whipped past him through the space, catching bags and sending kids' drawings into the air as Gnome stepped out into the dark, cold, wet corner bar of the universe as quickly as possible, closing the door behind him, pausing under the awning as the lying robot began to squeak. A supernatural distress signal, a warning shot crackled with hesitation, paused, and then lit up across the sky before fading back out to standard night black again. Gnome watched the world up there go dark and braced himself, blinking as the robot droned to a halt. Caution. Its voice box slumping into silence as the rain itself too stopped pattering, slowed and hung, held roundly globulated in the night air of the parking lot. Not even drips from the gutter dropped. All was still. Floating against gravity, each minute droplet gleaned its own pinpoint of light as a web of purple-white lightning crept across the sky in a vast arch, its pull retracting the very air as its traces and offshoots, delicate webs of illumination came to rain over everything. The rain-drenched streets, their tree-lined sidewalks, and a million wet leaves lit up in response. Behind him, piles and bodies lining the indoor corridor glowed, humming with captivating energy, hovering. For a moment he enjoyed the simplicity of all the lights, until it all dropped with a snap as the lightning bolt broke, cracking the sky open brighter than day, and all was vehicles approaching back to normal. That dang recording almost sounded as if it had gained a bit of gusto after its break. Hopping back into his truck, as he shuddered from the shock of the weather event, from the high above. Gnome wondered in a doom-feeling-filled moment just how long it would really take them, how long before real people really started to notice. Meteorologists could hem and haw and gasp and shrug all they wanted, but at some point, the particle physicists were going to chime in. Tracing any oddity back to the ZLL would take time. It would be difficult, of course, and the justification, not his but theirs, would be a hard sell. Maybe impossible, but in the meantime, he'd better just put the thought aside as not to ruin the evening. Anger towards the ZLL came swiftly and lasted longer these days, more so than ever before. The zipper people, he huffed indignantly. Settling himself in the cold but familiar environment of the cab, Gnome tossed his prized clipboard aside and noticed there was now also a package on the passenger's seat. Looking around quickly for any sign of the deliverer, a sly movement outside caught the corner of his eye as a large form disappeared around a corner into the dark recesses of the high-ceilinged tunnel, which was still endlessly emitting the caution vehicles approaching warning, the robot dutifully singing its steady tune as Gnome's bad eyes caught a quick flashlight streak across a sign reading City Library, Pulp Depot, West. Loading and unloading only. He thought, and started the engine. What do they load? The rumble of Gnome's pickup, paired with the brightness of its headlights, reset the stage back at the poker table, and the metallic gray jack-o'-lantern embossed on the envelope smiled right at Molly, who carefully picked it up while still mooring the departure of the clipboard. Pig-Eye had already dashed into the mudroom to scoot the step stool in front of the sink and fill the water cooker. Returning to the table, Pig-Eye flopped with pent-up exhaustion over the old man's brief visit. Yeah, you think? Of course. But he knows. Mullygrub rolled her eyes. He knows we were in his yard again, and he knows about the highly complex role-playing games and all the field trip permission slips and, probably even the treehouse we have been building on his property, using his stuff. Probably. But we can be diplomatic, and Bestie probably shouldn't be, stressed, even if she knows. She's just, she's not so good with the stressy stuff about how you're supposed to act with the adult stuff. Am I right? Right. Pig-Eye nodded, running his finger over the carved pumpkin's tiny teeth. Do you concur? I concur. So, we have to buffer all this strategically, a kind of very gentle catch and kill. Always so right, Pig-Eye confirmed as the kettle roared and his sister huffed. Well, back to work. Homework, Pig-Eye nodded, pretending to file and shuffle through a pile of papers. He promptly spilled a container of that white school glitter glue stuff. Molly picked up the letter, dragged a stool to the counter, where the remnants of a white plastic water cooker came dancing to a definitive boil. She expertly ran the envelope's seal back and forth over the flowing plume of steam from the nozzle until the adhesive gave way. Pulling out a card with the ZLL logo stamped in 3D ink on the top as if it were made of porcelain, a handwritten note, a small paper folded in quarters, fluttered to the floor, which Pig-Eye retrieved. Returning to their power work table, Molly opened the card, and a slim sheet of metal slid out, landing with a twangy thunk. The shiny object caught Pig-Eye's full attention as he set the note down in a puddle of glue and nuzzled up to his sister's shoulder as she read the invite, first silently to herself, just going over the details once, then twice, and frowning. Wait, this isn't a Halloween party. Is not? Look, here, barely Halloweeny. Hoo-wee, glitching out, muchacho. Big Eye categorically overreacted to things he didn't quite understand. You see what happens when you leave an envelope stuffing up to the interns? The inside thing doesn't even match the envelope. It doesn't even have a pumpkin on it. It has a clover. It was actually made out of real metal. Next to the words was a small cartoon of a person in an astronaut suit. She read aloud to Big Eye, who couldn't yet. Get out of Earth free. Like Monopoly style, Big Eye noted, nodding in approval as the reference to his favorite element of the game, the get out of jail free card. Flipping it over, Molly continued, Dear Miss Blank and Associates, the pleasance of your company is requested as the ZLL formally invites you and your family to the official viewing of the unveiling of the and zap went time in the world, shredding memory space like a high voltage whip. The sky sparked brilliantly, defective, like a search party floodlight with a hissing glitch as if short-circuited by a spray of seawater. Pure energy fizzled. Molly Grub felt the light, but saw none of it. A low, sinister hum, broken by a behemoth yawn, crept in, and her world sunk from bright black into the infinite, inhuman solace of deep, absolute nothing yet again. Her memory continued its own private tumble cycle through blips and snippets of info chum. The chunks between wake and sleep were unconscious, awaiting to be gobbled up again by this vicious nothing. Clues, time capsules, about what they had been, or done, or doing, rerun episodes on repeat, tumble cycle over and over, a reality which was feeling only loosely connected with this one, if at all. And the blankness that followed engulfed everything with a smothering unknowingness. These scenes resurfaced hauntingly, a sunken treasure, a karaoke playlist of eroded ghost ship songs from another life in another world which stuck, swam laps after drowning in the head, and somehow, not even knowing the words, we were expected to sing along. Peeling her body out of the kid-shaped impression it had made in the deep, damp moss covering the ground, she knew they found themselves in a forest clearing. The deep chill of sleeping outdoors without cover had gotten to her, and Molly groaned with aches and pains of somebody who hadn't stirred in ages. Heaving herself upright, her neurons began to misfire just like the randomly sparking sky. Flickered thoughts and hypotheses about what exactly might have happened. Impressions left her wondering what was real and what was wrong with her eyes. Drawing an absolute blank, she struggled to remember so much as what she was. Latching onto any mothy clues in the vast, empty caverns of her memory banks seemed highly unlikely. Small, fleeting connections, but as soon as they came, they slipped away with the ease of newts disappearing between the spaces between her fingers. A pond, worse than trying to catch catfish with your bare hands, which was something our extended family did quite well, but that was also another time and place, coming and going, vanishing like a dream expunged. Molly Grub was surprised to have a glimpse of her former life until it slipped away, just like one of those slippery animal things. So what was this now? Just very different. A few facts proceeded to tumble and trickle into her blank slate brain. The nudgings of these basics, such as she and her brother, Big Eye, and both their unfortunate nicknames, were, insofar as she knew, still two often deemed delinquent, independent, or their preferred term, freelance, homeschoolers, students, who, come to think of it, might be in big trouble now, since it was long far gone since they'd left a note or called or checked in with any other living creature. No telling how long since they'd regained consciousness, assuming they'd even lost it in the first place. She tried to place the last place, but it was in the middle of the night. Thoughts doggy-paddled through a murky mind fog. Cue the dramatic slivers of moonlight, which poked through abruptly, much needed, as if a cloud veil curtain had been keeping the full moon waiting backstage, and now had been brushed aside. She stared at the moon above. She could see it, and now waited patiently for her eyes to get her brain back on board. Microdots of brightness popped out across the surrounding night sky, visual anchors, lighthouse specks suspended in the oblivion beyond. Her immediate environment was highlighted, portions of the curling, knee-high mists slinking phantasm-like throughout the forest clearing she and her brother were plopped down upon. Vapors moved, slunk like giant, formless water serpents emerging from eons past, on the prowl, sinking their claws into the now. In contrast, the infinity floating up and away reminded Molly Grub of the other grounding things, and she considered the utter uselessness of even building the argument that the very highly complex role-playing game of their lives had delivered them to a place. The presumption of a very precious few facts seemed fairly certain that they were in a clearing, and this clearing was surrounded by very large trees, and that neither of these features had any relation to the tree fort they'd spent so much time working on. Something, somewhere deep within her, something enmeshed in her very biology, yanked a plug and her vision cut out. All was again a boundless visual landscape, more vast and existentially terrifying than the dead vacuum of space. Molly Grub's last thought before falling back into an abrupt, unconscious state was that they were no longer in their usual stomping grounds. The stakeout or campout or hangout. No, they were definitely not in old buddy Noam's backyard anymore.